Chers auditeurs,
Dear listeners,
bonjour.
welcome to Comme d'Archi Podcast Season 6.
Saison 6, dans le monde fascinant des architectes.
And in the architectural projects.
Je suis Anne-Charlotte Deponte, passionnée d'architecture et docteur des universités en histoire de l'archi.
I am one of the spokespersons of Anne-Charlotte, who is a PhD in architecture history.
Merci
Thank you
d'être avec moi aujourd'hui.
to be with us today.
Et
And
maintenant,
now,
lundi en français, place au talent.
and Wednesday, let's talk projects. In English, of course.
Bienvenue dans Comme d'Archi.
Dear listeners, this is Esther on behalf of Anne-Charlotte. Welcome to the latest issue of Comme d'Archi. Anne-Charlotte has written a special report on this week's interview with Philippe Prost and Antoine Picon, two high-profile figures from the world of architecture in France. Antoine Picon is also currently Director of Doctoral Research Programs at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Philippe Prost is a French architect and winner of France's Grand Prix National de l'Architecture in 2022. His work will be exhibited at the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine, Paris, France, from October 18th, 2024 to March 23rd, 2025. The exhibition is entitled La Mémoire Vive, or The Living Memory, and his agency, AAPP Atelier d'Architecture Philippe Prost, is based in Paris in the 2nd arrondissement. Anne-Charlotte transcribes the interview as follows. Part 1, and memory arises. The interview is introduced in memory of my forebears, Joseph Beucher, Sr., an organ builder who turned around the great Cavaillé-Coll factory in the 1930s. In memory of his wife, Marguerite, my grandmother, who was a pupil of Marcel Dupré. And concerning Philippe Prost's musical passion on the one hand, who began by playing the organ, but also in his way of apprehending the notion of heritage in continuity as a whole. On the other hand, I simply wanted to thank him for bearing such rare values, notably this audio-spatio-temporal perception. I know it without merit because I fell into it as a child. But to encounter it at the Architects during my visit to the exhibition was for me just extraordinary, particularly moving. Philippe Prost confirms that the scores in the exhibition that I was using at the time were bar scores transcribed by Marcel Dupré. The organ was an instrument that fascinated me, even though my family background was not at all musical. Later on, I came to understand that this instrument had something to do with space. It is situated. The organ case takes its place, not necessarily in a church. The resonance of a room is a very important thing. The reverberation time of a room, how the sound turns in a space. It's already a whole way of apprehending architecture. We usually apprehend it with our eyes, but architecture is also an infinite number of sounds and a way of experiencing space through sound. Back to Antoine Picon. He's an architect, polytechnician, and architectural historian. He was my history of architecture professor at the University of Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne. I have wonderful memories of his lectures. I particularly loved them because he would ask us to draw, for example, the detail of a timber frame. Of course, as I was just out of art school at the time, I was a bit ahead of my classmates in this respect, and I was delighted. In short, he was fascinating. He says he was always interested in architecture in cities, and also worked on techniques and utopias. On graduating from the École Polytechnique, he began to think about his future. He started at the Secretariat for Architectural Research at the Ministry of Urban Planning and Housing. Eventually, life took him to the United States. Writing is important to him. He began with French architecture, with the Enlightenment. Today, he's more interested in the present. Architecture's curious short circuit between extreme materiality and the exercise of reason fascinates him. For Philippe Prost, the desire for architecture came with time. Working on music at first, one day architecture took over. It became too difficult to devote oneself to two passions, organ music and architecture. He joined the Versailles School of Architecture, UP3. During his studies, he was marked by two teachers, Philippe Panneret, an architect who taught typomorphology, and Henri Gaudin, an architect deeply rooted in long history. One day, by a stroke of luck, the owner of the Citadel on Belle-Île entrusted Philippe Prost with the task of restoring the Citadel, while he was busy teaching architectural history and doing research. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. The combination of the two men is prolific. Successful projects are those where there are human encounters, he tells us. He believes he has progressed over the course of his encounters, demanding the highest standards for himself and others, for the rationality of what we do, while at the same time trying to achieve poetry and emotion. The Citadel experience took place over a long period. In retrospect, his opinion is that, and I quote, "Today, if I've won this National Architecture Prize, I think it's the path I've taken between heritage and architecture, and the gradual blending of all this into a single whole has, in fact, resonated with the times we live in. For a long time, there was an extremely opaque, strong, watertight division between the ancients and the moderns, with restorative architects portrayed as conservative, not to say reactionary, and creative architects as progressive. So, what does progressive mean? What does reactionary mean? I'm not a philosopher. This opens up a wide range of debates, especially when you look at it more closely. It's much more complicated." End of quote. Part 2. Conserve, maintain, transform. Antoine Picon continues. We are in a period of great fluidity in people's career paths, and great anxiety, even tension, about identity. As a result, the question of heritage has become even more important. Today, even when we're building something new, the question arises, and the notion of heritage is exploding. We have fewer and fewer resources, and we have more and more things we want to preserve, which raises a series of increasingly interesting questions. At the same time, we're in the midst of this kind of hardening of our heritage, and, at the same time, very profound transformations. The tricky thing is to manage this somewhat disconcerting continuum between heritage and creation, in an ideological context that is, it has to be said, deleterious. And this is relatively new. We also have to admit that we're going to be living in a France, and this may displease some people, where the social composition are going to be very different from what France was at the end of the Second World War. Here too, we need to reconsider the notion of heritage. For me, one of the interests of what Philippe is doing is trying to negotiate with this complicated context. Philippe Prost tells us that his first experience with the Citadel lasted 13 years, which taught him to work over a long period of time on a building site to discover a site with, on the one hand, archives in hand, and, on the other, a physical, visual perception of a site that we see in all seasons, where we discover things 5 years after having come there, because the sun doesn't shine in the same place, because there isn't the same humidity in the air. Then came the restoration of a bastion in Vannes, followed by the Musée de la Marine de Loire project in Châteauneuf-sur-Loire, presenting an ethnographic museum in the former stables of a chateau listed as a historic monument. How to install collections in such a space with an extension. Then there was work on the ZAC de la Réunion in Paris, where all the buildings were slated for demolition. The question arose, can any of them be saved? In ZACs, the land registry is erased. Saving a few meant building others. 4 of them were kept, revealing the original plot of land. Finally, the Ring of Memory is a total creation using the substrates of memory. Commemorating memory raises the question of architecture in a different way. To inscribe the monument on this site without obstructing its skyline. If I was capable of doing this work, Philippe Prost emphasizes, it's all the preliminary work that made it possible. I try to emphasize the interlocking of scales. Architecture is one and indivisible, a whole with which you have to come to terms. You have to understand it, otherwise you're just going through the motions. Inscribing the pre-existing work in time is fundamental. Antoine Picon describes the Ring of Memory as a symbolic project ex nihilo, daring in its immense overhang, which Jean-Marc Vail helped to create. With Vauban, forms are immobile. With the Ring of Lorette, it's very much a journey, an itinerary that reflects the tensions between expressiveness and reason that make this architecture so interesting. It's a striking architecture. Part 3, about the exhibition. Philippe Prost recounts. With my associate Catherine Seller, who is my wife too, we met the then president of the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine, Catherine Chevillot. She was the first to suggest that the exhibition be included in the permanent galleries, given the historical significance of the agency's work. End of quote. This is precisely what Philippe Prost and Catherine Seller wanted. The curators are Francis Rambert, Director of Architectural Creation at the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine, and Margot Darius, a doctorate in architecture, critic and winner of the AAPP 2023 prize in the Other Ways of Architecture category. Marina Kemis is the chosen young scenographer. In this way, the exhibition unfolds within the Cité, which itself already intrinsically demonstrates the art of transforming reality, which operates on every scale and never stops. Margot Darius has chosen a 3-part exhibition route: the course of time, the shape of the present, 2 territories and a creative process. This last section shows that many people work on a project. In fact, heritage knows how to showcase know-how. That's what they wanted to show. Part 4, to conclude. What does it mean to make a work of architecture at the frontier of what is already there? This is what interests Antoine Picon in certain architectural productions, notably that of Philippe Prost. He concludes, to what extent do points of view change from one society to another? This feeling of absolute otherness. The present which is difficult to forget today. The urgency is quite particular. The situation is unheard of. The meaning is what we need to rediscover through architecture. The collective, civic sense, helping people to agree on something, and praising solutions that don't break. Dear listeners, thank you for listening, and many thanks to our 2 VIP guests. We look forward to seeing you next week for another exciting new issue. Until then, take care. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening.
And thanks to the sound engineer who was collaborating with us today.
Don't forget to tune in to our previews on Instagram at Comme d'Archi Podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, don't hesitate to promote it by giving it 5 stars and a little comment on Apple Podcast or on your favorite podcast platform. And above all, subscribe to listen to all of our episodes for free. See you soon, and until then, take care of yourself.